So, how to read Lord of the Rings? This is the question I hope to answer and to demonstrate the answer in my two lectures on the Fellowship of the Ring. This lecture is going to deal with Book 1, and then the next will be with Book 2. And by Book 1, I mean the two separate books within the volume, the Fellowship of the Ring. As my question implies, there are wrong ways to read this book, but we're going to look at one of the right ways to read it. And as we begin the summer cycle into our year-long course on the Poetics of Enchantment, I want to step back and consider some of the concepts that we've been exploring so far and bringing with us to some of the literature that we have so far read. We're broadly considering enchantment literature in this whole course. And enchantment here, we're meaning as an aesthetic experience largely. So one way this works is that I've drawn out a couple of definitions of enchantment from my Substack article a few months ago when we started this. But just to review, using it as a state of consciousness in response to beauty. Another is this tremendous feeling of awe, wonder, or inspiration. And the word tremendous here is doing a lot of work. We're going to see it come up in Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Fish. But also, I was harkening back to Rudolf von Otto's concept of the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the tremendous and fascinating mystery. Another way we're using the word enchantment is in the way that Shelley used it, a concept of the diviner manner of poetry. It's this awareness and a sense of a deeper spiritual reality within nature. And this comes from Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. Speaking of the diviner manner of poetry, it awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world. It makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. So here we have a really nice precursor to Schlosky's defamiliarization. And then a fourth way we're understanding it is enchantment as an encounter with beauty that leads to greater love for the earth, for yourself, and to others. And this comes from a very Wordsworthian assertion from The Prelude. It's something you can pick up in many of his shorter lyrics as well. These are very spacious parameters into which Tolkien's work fits quite comfortably. In his essays on fairy stories, Tolkien outlines three characteristics of successful fantasy and what it means to and how to judge his work. The first, Tolkien argues, is that at the heart of fairy stories is fantasy, this imaginative construction of a secondary world that operates by its own internally consistent laws. This subcreation is an act of artistic integrity for Tolkien. The Fellowship of the Ring should thus be evaluated on how effectively it creates a secondary world imbued with wonder, held together by coherence, and sounding with this mythic resonance, and how successfully it offers readers a credible escape into an internally self-reflective or self-consistent universe. He's very meticulous with his details, that his myth is not just a myth, it's a history in a way. And he was reading many histories at the time, Gibbon's histories, for example. He's very interested in how history is written, and that's part of what he's doing here. So the first thing, I want to introduce three concepts for Tolkien's idea of fantasy. And this comes from On Fairy Stories, which is an excellent essay. Hope to read a little bit of it in our discussion on Wednesday and to discuss it. But the first is to get a handle on Tolkien's theological aesthetics. And I want to introduce the concept of mythopoesis. This is something that you members have actually brought up several times in the discussion quite productively, I think. Mythopoesis, the act of myth making, is the sacred labor key into Tolkien's theological aesthetics, how the work hangs together. Creativity for Tolkien involves a unique participation in divine energies. And I'm using the language divine energies, harkening back to the Neoplatonism of Erugena. That's not something that was part of Tolkien's work, but I think we can connect it within this whole canon we've been studying. Tolkien's term subcreation, which was coined in On Fairy Stories, is the particular dignity of human artistry. For Tolkien, this was a mode of participating in the ongoing creation, a process which is different from, but related to, the process of meaning making. They're related, but they are very different. Tolkien wrote that subcreation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, it's different from just mere documentation. And there's this famous passage from his essay, this verse paragraph. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, subcreator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. That right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. And those of you who have read Coleridge's 13th chapter of the Biographia Literaria understand how romantic theories of the imagination are really informing Tolkien's whole aesthetics and his whole idea of creation here. Now, some might consider this to be a sort of subcreation like Prometheus, this figure who defied the gods by giving fire to humans. But in other ways, subcreation is not really theft. For Tolkien, it's more the proper use of the uniquely human gift. To invent for Tolkien is really to remember. And we can think of it connecting with this whole tradition of enchantment literature, that it's a way to rejoin the logos, the kind of the eternal song, through symbolic mimesis. In Platonic terms, subcreation involves acknowledging the presence of three-dimensional objects when all around you are two-dimensional shadows. So going all the way back to Plato's Allegory of the Cave, which we read several months ago, it's this moment of recognition, to see again, or to think, or to be aware of again. In a way, for Tolkien, the subcreation is a mode of recovering, or it's recovering a mode of seeing, I should say. And this is where Tolkien's Poetics of Enchantment come in. And we'll talk about recovery in just a moment. But for a work of literature that is set within a different world, or at least a different time than our world occupies, the moral laws of the universe must be established convincingly, and I think Tolkien's work is a moral work. And that's different from saying that it's moralistic, because it avoids moralism. And this sets his work apart from narratives of fantasy that are largely propelled by action or quests for personal gain. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, the laws of moral and physical order are really what drive it. And these laws are introduced, they have to be introduced in one of two ways. Either by the by, as in the case with the episode with Tom Bombadil, we get a sense as to how the laws are working in the world and how some beings are above the laws, are operating by higher laws. Or the other way is through these artfully chosen moments when the tension is high enough to sustain the burden of explication. So for those of you who might write fantasy, this is you know of this trick. You can't really explain how the world works without bogging down the narrative. You have to subtly bring it in on the side. And this is something that I think Tolkien learns to do well, and he does really well. There's that specific moment when Gandalf is describing to Frodo the rings of power. I think this is an excellent example of that. In Eregion, long ago, many elven rings were made, he says. Magic rings, as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent and some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full blown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. A mortal Frodo who keeps one of the great rings does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. And here you can see Tolkien working the great seamless revision upon The Hobbit. Because when he was writing The Hobbit, the one ring that Bilbo found wasn't actually the one ring of Sauron. I mean, it became that. But as he wanted to develop the mythology further, that's what the ring became this great device. And it works really well, I think, in this moment. This is a great moment from the book. It shelters the reader under this mythic architecture of ancient history, of a fabricated ancient history. Tolkien's mythopoetic craft renders a world with strata of history, um, layers of art, and even cosmology and politics so finely wrought that it seems autonomous. There's really not much to there's not really much that the reader has to do to suspend his disbelief or her disbelief, as Coleridge would say. The work really compels it. The tale of the elves' craft, of Sauron's deception, of the forging of the One Ring unfolds with the authority of ancient scripture rather than mere fantasy here, are really as ancient history even. The geography with Eregion and Mordor, which is mentioned later in this passage, the languages that come up in this scene, the black speech, the elvish, and the metaphysical consequences of wielding power all function cohesively within this secondary reality which consistently compels belief. Tolkien's Mythopoesis achieves a grandeur akin to that of classical myth at times. I think there are at times when it really sustains this high pitch. The world doesn't just exist to serve Frodo's journey. This is how the work differs from a romance that we've read, the romance genre from the medieval period. Rather, Frodo's burden derives meaning from the gravity of the world in which it comes to him. And this process of subcreation is liturgical in the sense that it involves a highly regulated participatory ritual. I want to step back and think about the process of reading fantasy. I spoke a little bit about it in the George MacDonald lecture on Fantastes, talked a little bit in other essays on poems about how reading is this participation. And I think that's partly what's going on here with this enchantment literature. The Greek word liturgikos means of or for service or ministering. And it's often applied to religious services. You have the Jewish liturgies, you have the ancient Eastern Orthodox liturgies, the Roman Catholic liturgies, and some Protestant liturgies. It's an order of service in which one is led through the rites of imaginative passages that lead through the various stages of the hero's journey. It's interesting. You can actually map the ancient liturgies, the Roman Catholic liturgies from the Eastern Orthodox, onto the hero's journey that was mapped out by Campbell through the call from the going out of oneself, the catabasis, the descent into the underworld, the return again following the dismissal, being going back out into the world. In fact, that's where the word mass comes from, the dismissal, the return. And it's the sending forth after the circle of the hero's journey is complete. And I think that reading, oftentimes experiencing a story, a narrative, is the same sort of liturgical participation that's going on in the minds of the reader. And this is what the reading and the writing of fairy stories is all about. I think for Tolkien, all reading of great novels, poetry, fantasy, drama, are all kinds of this liturgy. And that's why it matters that the literature you're reading is good. Tolkien's idea of mythopoesis aligns partly with medieval exegesis, in which poetry is the figure or eternal truth rather than a projection of psychological interiority. We read Fantastes in my lectures as the dramatization of psychological interiority. You can do that with this book. In the case with MacDonald, as with Tolkien, I think it's more than that. It does more. Tolkien's interesting in particular because his idea of imagination is closely associated with language. And the stories actually came about after the languages. He invented languages and then invented the stories for the languages. I think that that's really interesting. The word precedes narrative, or language precedes um, story. And this goes back, I think, in my mind, to Dante Alighieri's views of language. According to Dante, in his treatise, De Vulgare Eloquentia, language is the ladder which connects worlds. For him, it's the divine world and the human world. Language, and by extension narrative, is the trace of the logos implanted in humanity, and it is capable of lifting the soul toward contemplation of higher things, which is what the Divine Commedia is all about. Dante presents language as the hinge between heaven and earth, nature and grace, time and eternity. It's this meeting point. And in this, Dante and many of the other medieval Catholic writers and theologians anticipated or laid the groundwork for Tolkien's own sacramental vision of language. And Tolkien, as a Roman Catholic, is very much participating in this intellectual tradition, and so are his works. It's partly interesting to keep in mind regarding the theological aesthetics. So Tolkien furthers this by applying it to a particular art form, fairy tale. Tolkien argues that the heart of fairy lies in the imaginative construction of that secondary world that operates according to its own internal moral principle, consistent laws. And this subcreation is the act of integrity. And so I think the Fellowship of the Ring and much of Tolkien's work should be evaluated on how effectively it creates a secondary world that's imbued with wonder, held together by coherence, echoing with this mythic resonance, which all contribute towards the reader's credible escape into this internally self-consistent universe. So that was the first, this process of coherence. Now the second is recovery and escape. I'm going to think about those two related terms. And I do use the word escape. Tolkien used it too. So the second principle we could actually call the recovery principle, and that is that fairy stories enable a recovery, a renewed perception of familiar things, and we escape as liberation from the banalities and burdens of life. In our case, modern life, which comes with, I think, a more intense set of burdens that Tolkien, his work, helps remedy. I'm thinking of recovery as the way he described this regaining of a clear view. He writes, I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need, in any case, to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. I find the conclusion of his sentences sometimes so astonishing. Uh, from possessiveness is not how I thought he was going to end that sentence. And there's something so key to that, so relevant for Lord of the Rings. This idea of possession, as we're going to see as we read through the novel, is really key. So for a good reader or critic of fairy stories, he or she would assess whether the Fellowship of the Ring, if we're going to take that as our case study, allows readers to see the ordinary world with fresh eyes, and whether its depiction of heroism, beauty, peril, and the journey all provide meaningful release from the constraints of the primary world. And as we'll see soon from a letter in Tolkien, that the secondary world actually renews our sense of purpose in the primary world. And this implies a correlation to the fantastical circumstances of the story with our own lives. And this correlation, he was very, very adamant about this. This correlation is not allegory in the sense of a one-to-one relationship. And we know that. We would not, I think, mistake this as an allegory, and we wouldn't read it like we would be reading Milton, or excuse me, not Milton, but Spenser, whom we did read. So here are some excerpts on allegory. He writes in a letter, Middle-earth is our world. I have, of course, placed the action in a purely imaginary, though not wholly impossible, period of antiquity, in which the shape of the continental masses was different. So Middle-earth is actually our world. I think I mentioned this in the video, but it's a prehistory. It's a fantasy history. And then he was writing to W.H. Auden. He says, always accepting, of course, any interpretations in the mode of simple allegory, that is, the particular and topical. In a larger sense, it is, I suppose, impossible to write any story that is not allegorical in proportion as it comes to life, since each of us is an allegory, embodying in a particular tale and clothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth, and everlasting life. Also, not how I expected him to end that paragraph, but I wish he'd go on to explain that a little bit more. But there's something, Tolkien scholars are always telling each other what they can or cannot do with connections to Middle Earth and our own world. But we should note that there are correspondences. It's not the same, a correspondence is not the same as an allegory, but there are similarities. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't just outright reject allegory, but he adds this modifier, the mode of simple allegory. And there's in some sense that we all are an allegory, or participate in one. I leave that for your further consideration, because I want to move on to the third point of On Fairy Stories, which is this idea of eucatastrophe. Perhaps Tolkien's most distinctive criterion for a work of this kind is that phrase he came up with, the eucatastrophe, the good, or the reversal of the catastrophe. A sudden joyous turn that brings not mere resolution, but the glimpse of transcendent grace. In judging the Fellowship of the Ring, one must consider whether the narrative gestures toward this deep consolation through a moment that affirms hope even in the face of despair. And this quality, Tolkien holds, gives fairy stories their highest moral and aesthetic value. So in book one, this book doesn't offer the full-blown eucatastrophe that the later volumes provide. But the great catastrophe that overshadows this first volume is the threat of Frodo's solitude. That's the great tragedy that's always pressing in and always has to be resisted. The great tragedy that the books make implicitly clear is that if the ring can isolate Frodo, or can make Frodo isolate himself, then the whole quest will fail. And that threat looms in the early chapters of Book One, when Frodo assumes to bear his burden in secret and will continue to bear it in solitude. He discovers instead that his friends have known of his burden and have prepared to journey with him. As Mary will say, "We are horribly afraid, but we are coming with you, or following you like hounds." And it's interesting that the great tragedy of these books is what threatens ourselves in this world. Look no further to the recently coined loneliness epidemic, or how difficult it is for people, especially men in particular, to make friends these days, and you'll understand how the books are speaking to a whole new generation of readers in a whole new way. There's this great quotation by Tolkien to his son, Christopher, that I just want to share here about the work of literature. He says, "But if literature teaches us anything at all, it is this, that we have in us an eternal element, free from care and fear, which can survey things that in life we call evil with serenity. That is not without appreciating their quality, but without any disturbance of our spiritual equilibrium. Not in the same way, but in some such way, we shall all doubtless survey our own story when we know it, and a great deal more of the whole story." And the letter goes on. But here it is again, ourselves within a whole story. This concept of our participation in something of a larger narrative. I think it's something really key for Tolkien. So this revelation is a eucatastrophic moment on Hobbit scale that will be uh, redoubled at the end of Book Two of the Fellowship, which we'll read next week. Samwise is the great eucatastrophe, I think, of book one, of the first volume. So our judgment about this principle will have to be suspended until then. In the next remaining 25 minutes of this lecture, I want to talk about place. We're going to discuss one of the most important places in Middle-earth for this narrative, and that's the Shire. At first glance, it's unremarkable. And upon second glance, it still is unremarkable. It's not like Lothlorien's otherworldly radiance. It possesses, though, this prelapsarian wholeness. This prelapsarian means before the fall. It's a theological term, but you can apply it to narrative more generally and poetry. It's the state of childhood. It's the state of really innocence. There's the Shire is fertility, conviviality, local order, country manners. This is the Arcadia in the Virgilian sense. Bounded, rural, innocent. It's the Garden of Eden in a way. It at least has this hidden harmony with nature and time. It's girdled round by rivers and hills. It's forgotten in obscurity. It's secretly protected by rangers, we learn. Aragorn is one of them. This is the company that Gildor calls the Wandering Company, but it is bounded most of all by ignorance. By ignorance of its inhabitants. And as the company of hobbits, the Four, journey past its protected borders, they gain a growing sense of this place's fragility. And as the illusion of protection wears off, the hobbits begin to sense the danger of the outer world pressing in, the precarity of the Shire, the rings of time that surround it's girdled by space, but also time. You've got it's measured by breakfasts, elevensies, tea, meals, birthdays, harvests, seasons of the year, generations of their forefathers, hobbit lore. Uh, but its disruption is marked by another ring, the ring itself, and the black riders who come searching for it, which marks not just this political instability, but it's also showing how how ontologically fragile the Shire is, and you can glimpse the difficulty by which Frodo slowly comprehends this, especially in his conversation with Gildor here. I knew that danger lay ahead, of course, but I did not expect to meet it in our own Shire. Can't a hobbit walk from the water to the river in peace? But it is not your own Shire, said Gildor. Others dwelt here before hobbits were, and others will dwell here again when hobbits are no more. The wide world is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out. And this is the first part of the journey, and the shadows is beginning to fall on Frodo after this point. And it's the stage in everyone's development, really, of consciousness. A state in which one suddenly realizes the illusion of immutability, that reality is not insulated from change, but is in fact permeable to all kinds of forces beyond one's control, some of them natural, some of them social, some of them evil. And this stage will lead either to one of two things in a person, either despair, which often looks like retreat, or a form of escapism, which a form of retreat or a form of escapism, that's one response, or it leads to responsibility. So those are the two: despair, retreat, or responsibility. And Frodo's call to leave the Shire mirrors the responsible hero that we've seen this type before. In the previous lectures, we talked about how the prisoner in Plato's cave is rather reluctant to be shown the truth. It was a point in one of our discussions, the fact that the prisoner is first dragged out of the cave. And that's a feature of his allegory that's often forgotten. And we've seen this before in other literature. Uh, Moses is reluctant. The prophet Jonah is at Nineveh is reluctant. Hamlet is reluctant to believe the ghost of his father and act, and must scrupulously test the veracity of its claims before taking action, and almost doing so too late. Frodo, too, is slowly beginning to understand the danger, and that's why will, the human, the power of human volition, is so central to the moral topography of Middle-earth. To speak in Tolkien's Christian typological terms, Frodo becomes a vessel of redemption, and he is also typologically the Christ, the priest figure. In terms of romance, he's a Parsifal figure. He's not the knight of strength like Aragorn or Boromir, but eventually he is the knight of purity, of endurance, of hidden grace, who will eventually take the burden upon himself. We'll talk about the ring, and then talk about Tom Bombadil. I'll say a word about the ring now. It's going to come up again in the next lecture. But this journey towards spiritual sacrifice is accelerated by the ring, an object of power and deceptive origin. It is a kind of anti-sacrament. And if you think of the concept of the sacrament in the Roman Catholic tradition of which Tolkien was part, it's this idea that God's presence becomes one with the material, transforms the material, and in the case of the Eucharist, is a moment in which the divine comes down and encounters the recipients through the material form. So if you think of the ring as being within that whole type of object, it makes good sense. An anti-Eucharist. It's a material form that offers power without grace, immortality without communion, and it isolates rather than it unites. Instead of condescending into an incarnational emptying out, the ring elevates its wearer to the point of spiritual corruption. To wield the ring is to carry within oneself the false sacrament, a perversion of the divine presence into a domination. In traditional Christian typology, the Eucharist unites the believer with Christ through kenosis, so the presence of Christ is self-emptying again, almost like the incarnation being reenacted. And the ring unites the bearer with Sauron through libido dominandi, the will to dominate. And you think back to that word possessiveness, and I think it It's part of what is moving and propelling this narrative. We know that this is the sole motivation for Sauron's power. To say a word about Bombadil and his flippant handling of the ring, which is almost so flippant that it destroys the gravity of the rest of of the book and all of the gravity that's been building up to that moment. He is, I think, the opposite of Sauron, whom the hobbits meet in the forest. So Bombadil, the hobbits meet in the forest. When the hobbits come to the house of Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, there is that telling question that Frodo asks: who is Tom Bombadil? And many scholars and readers have debated this question since it is not altogether clear what Tom Bombadil is. Tolkien himself said in a letter that he represents the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire countryside. This was from letter 26. But that only tells us how Tolkien was inspired, not the origin of Bombadil or what he is. And here's what Goldberry says about him. Frodo asks, "Fair lady," said Frodo again after a while, "tell me, if my asking does not seem foolish, who is Tom Bombadil?" "He is," said Goldberry, staying her swift movements and smiling. Frodo looked at her questioningly. "He is, as you have seen him," she said in answer to his look. "He is the master of wood, water, and hill." "Then all this strange land belongs to him?" "No, indeed," she answered, and her smile faded. "That would indeed be a burden." She added in a low voice, as if to herself, "The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever caught old Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. He has no fear. Tom Bombadil is master." In passing, we're introduced to a distinction between the master of the wood and owning the wood. And this is part of the major theme that's running through Lord of the Rings, this distinction between domination and stewardship. Bombadil is clearly a mythic residue of pre-fall, pre-temporal consciousness. Bombadil, whoever he is, I would argue, he at least represents what Sauron in his corrupted form is not. Sauron dwells in the high towers of Barad-dûr. Tom is hidden in the valleys of the old forests. Sauron exercises dominion in the form of possession and tyranny. Bombadil is master of the wood. His mastery clearly involves some kind of stewardship that honors the autonomy of those within the domain. Sauron reigns high, alone. Tom dwells in a simple cottage with Goldberry. And I've always been really interested in Goldberry and who she is. Robert Graves has an interesting book, The White Goddess, which argues that true poetic myth arises from a matriarchal, lunar, seasonal consciousness, what he calls the Muse tradition, which was overwritten by the solar patriarchal poets. So this is Graves' theory. It's a really compelling book, although not always convincing, but I think it just as likely that the ancient cultures of our own world were neither patriarchal nor matriarchal, neither exclusively goddess worshippers nor exclusively father worshippers, but involved some kind of harmonious balance between the two. And I think in some way, Bombadil and Goldberry represent that balance. And of course, in thinking in terms of myth in a psychological sense, this is the perfect balance of the harmonious whole. You can also think of it in the alchemic sense as well. Also very different from Sauron. His whole company are slaves, basically. So I think Bombadil and Goldberry emerge within Tolkien's text as surviving figures of this deeper stratum. He he's the ar- he's the archaic green man, or the spirit of the land. She's the river, the land's living source, a vestal sovereign of vegetal renewal, and their presence evokes a world where nature is both soul-bearing and volitional. I mean, the way that Origina conceives of nature's energies. There's a book I was reading recently, Marie-Louise von France. She's written a analysis of fairy tales, and she often identifies such figures like Tom Bombadil, because there are figures like him in fairy tales, as expressions of the self in its untouched archetypal wholeness. Bombadil is not a hero, nor God in the pagan sense, and he's barely a character integral to the narrative, many have argued. But Tom Bombadil is some kind of numinous remainder, some kind of echo of the time before symbolic fragmentation, before historical narrative and psychological fragmentation, a time way before Sauron, which is why he can be so flippant with the ring. He names and thus knows each thing in the forest. His authority is not political, as it is with the hobbits. It's not martial, as it is of the descendants of the Númenóreans, but rather it's relational. He is, as Goldberry says. And as Tolkien says, he is the eldest, yet not aged. So we leave book one with the episode at Weathertop in Frodo's journey to Rivendell. So after meeting Tom Bombadil, they journey through increasingly perilous lands, encountering signs of pursuit and danger, and they eventually arrive at Bree, where they meet the mysterious ranger named Strider, who is Aragorn, who becomes their guide. And traveling with Aragorn toward Rivendell, they are ambushed by the Black Riders. This happens at Weathertop, this old lookout station, where Frodo is wounded by a Morgul blade, which marks this turning point toward shadow and deeper peril. We know who the Nazgûl are because in that very concise explanation we reviewed from Gandalf, they are those who have passed under the shadow of Sauron. They're not external enemies, but they're not external enemies alone. They're also these agents of despair. Frodo's wound is, in a way, somewhat like a stigmata that opens him up to deeper suffering and spiritual insight. So this goes into the visionary role because we talked a little bit about the role of suffering for the visionary when we were reading Julian of Norwich and Emily Dickinson and her conception of the poet as a martyr. And suffering was, of course, very important to Norwich. It seems really important here as well to this deeper insight, how Tolkien is cultivating a second sight in a way, a symbolic perception through narrative. And I think this is part of the pedagogical aim of the text. This is what the text is trying to teach. So Tolkien's myth it's escapist in the best possible way because it's a type of liberation, an escape from something dangerous, which involves a return to something ordinary, made new. And in that sense, it's eschatological as well. The story begins in a garden and sets out towards the wasteland. Just as Genesis is fulfilled in Revelation, you begin with the garden, end with the city. You see that pattern too over the whole arc of the story. So too, the Shire is only truly saved through its descent into exile and return, specifically the four hobbits, going into exile and coming back. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll consider Wednesday a little bit about what makes this literature great or not great. I'll have a little bit of discussion there on Wednesday. But next week, we're going to consider book two. So be reading book two, and we'll likely focus on Lothlorien, and we will focus on the end of book two. And then, as I said, the week after that, we're focusing on Elizabeth Bishop. So to everyone who joined us on YouTube, thanks for watching, and until next time.